The air was still when the question dropped like a shell, "Who among you is pregnant?" The American officer's voice was flat, procedural, but the silence that followed was anything but. Rows of exhausted Japanese women stood barefoot on the packed coral dust of a Pacific Island camp. It was August 1945. Their khaki blouses were stained with salt, their faces hollowed by weeks of capture and disbelief. Somewhere beyond the wire, a truck coughed, gulls circled, and the wind dragged a tent flap open with a soft hiss. They weren't soldiers, not exactly clerks, nurses, and typists pulled into the front by the collapse of an empire. Only days earlier, they had been told to die rather than surrender. Now they were being asked about pregnancy. To them, the word itself was a wound. One interpreter repeated the question slowly in Japanese. Still, no answer. A drop of sweat rolled down one woman's cheek, and another shifted her stance to hide trembling legs. The officer's clipboard gleamed in the sunlight. For the Americans, it was a medical routine. For the women, it was the moment they realized they were not being executed. The world had inverted again. Enemy hands now decided who would live, who would be examined, who would be fed. Reports later counted more than 300 Japanese civilian women held in such island camps after the battles of Saipan and Guam. Most were barely in their 20s, survivors of mass suicides their officers had ordered. They had expected fire, instead they got questions. Even in defeat, one of them would later write in her diary, "We were still women, they saw that first, not our uniforms." That line captures the cognitive rupture of that morning, the shock of being treated not as tools of war, but as human bodies needing care. The guards didn't smile, but neither did they shout. They simply waited, and in that waiting, the women began to realize something more terrifying than death. Their fate was now to live under the eyes of the enemy. The silence stretched so long it became a sound of its own. Then, one young clerk fainted, collapsing into the dust. As medics rushed forward, the rest stared, half in fear, half in awakening, because this was only the beginning. The story of how they became captives, not corpses. Hours before that question was ever asked, those same women were running through smoke and screaming wind. It was mid-July 1940, for the Battle of Saipan. The imperial banners had fallen, and the last Japanese commanders were ordering civilians to die with honor. Families clutched grenades, mothers carried children to the cliffs. The sky over Marpy Point burned red from artillery. Amid the chaos, a group of nurses, clerks, and telephone operators, about 200 in all, hid inside a half-collapsed bunker. They could hear gunfire and waves smashing against the rocks below. Their orders were clear: no surrender. They had been told Americans were monsters, men who would mutilate them, parade them, enslave them. Death is purity. One officer shouted before detonating himself at the entrance. The explosion sealed them in darkness for hours. When the dust cleared, they crawled out, dazed, their ears ringing. Outside, the imperial flag was gone. In its place stood an American patrol, helmets tilted, weapons half lowered. One soldier shouted something none of them understood, but his tone wasn't violent. Reports estimate more than 1,000 Japanese civilians jumped to their deaths on Saipan's cliffs that week. But these women did not. Their survival was accidental, and in the culture they came from, accidental survival was shame. When the Americans offered water, the women refused at first, expecting poison. When medics extended soap and bandages, they hesitated, waiting for torture. But instead of brutality, they met method. Their wrists were tagged, their names where possible recorded. They were led to tents, given rations, and told to rest. Why aren't they killing us? one whispered to another that night. The interpreter, a nice eye translator from California, overheard and quietly replied, "Because the war is ending." Those words hung in the humid air like smoke that wouldn't rise. For the first time, they realized surrender didn't mean erasure. It meant existing in a new, confusing kind of captivity. By dawn, as the tide receded, they watched soldiers unloading crates of canned food instead of ammunition. The ocean was calm again, the guns quiet, and yet, in that unnatural peace, another battle began, the one inside their heads. Because if survival wasn't shame, then everything they'd been taught had already died. The following morning, trucks arrived to move them to a camp built not for execution, but for care. The trucks rattled over coral roads under a white, pitiless sun. When the convoy stopped, the women saw something they didn't expect: a camp that smelled not of blood, but of soap. Canvas tents stretched in neat lines, water drums gleamed in the light, and an American flag flapped listlessly above a makeshift gate. It was late 1944, and this was no prison. It was a temporary holding camp designed by engineers to process hundreds of captured civilians. For the first time in weeks, they were told to remove their shoes, wash, and eat. To women raised on rationed rice and military slogans, the first shock wasn't freedom, it was abundance. Each woman received a tin plate loaded with white bread, canned peaches, and beans. 2,000 calories a day, one nurse muttered after overhearing a medic's notes. Back home, they had survived on less than half of that. The food felt obscene, like an insult wrapped in kindness. Some cried quietly while eating. Others forced down each bite with trembling hands. Then came the soap. The Americans insisted everyone disinfect before entering the sleeping quarters. Buckets of chlorinated water steamed in the heat. The guards weren't gentle, but they weren't cruel either. Every movement was methodical, professional. "We are not here to shame you," one interpreter translated. "We are here to keep you alive." The words made no sense. These were supposed to be barbarians, not caretakers. That night, as lanterns flickered, the women compared notes. "They even gave us sanitary towels," whispered one clerk. "Our own officers never did." The irony was unbearable. In that moment, the first crack appeared in their armor of indoctrination. The enemy's hygiene was cleaner than the Empire's honor. Yet beneath the routine lay tension. American doctors had begun compiling medical reports, noting exhaustion, malnutrition, and signs of pregnancy. They didn't ask yet, not directly, but every woman felt the weight of the gaze, the way the officer's eyes lingered, calculating, cataloging. Something was coming, a reckoning of bodies and memory. The next morning, a loudspeaker crackled. "All women, line up for medical inspection." The same officer who'd handed out soap now held a clipboard. The smell of disinfectant filled the air again, but this time it wasn't cleansing. It was interrogation. The women stood in formation, backs straight, eyes fixed on the horizon. The loudspeaker had gone silent, replaced by the rhythmic sound of boots and paper. Officers checking names, medics murmuring to one another. It was early morning, the sun still low, and the dust from yesterday's truck tires hung like fog over the camp. The lineup wasn't punishment, but it felt like one. The same hands that had given them food now held stethoscopes. A bilingual interpreter stepped forward. His Japanese was stiff but clear. Medical check, routine, you will answer honestly. For most, honesty had always been dangerous. The women glanced at one another, uncertain whether to obey. Then a sergeant barked a shorter command in English, followed by the question that cut through everything: "Who among you is pregnant?" The words seemed to echo across the rows.
No one moved.
The women had heard rumors. Some said the Americans were trying to identify victims of their own soldiers. Others whispered it was a test of morality.
The truth was simpler and far more human. They were checking for prenatal care.
The American medical logs later recorded that out of 214 women processed that morning, 17 showed early signs of pregnancy. To the women, though, it felt like exposure. Each heartbeat became a confession. A few clutched their bellies instinctively. Others stood rigid, ashamed. One doctor whispered to another, "We need midwives here fast." The interpreter, realizing the confusion, repeated in Japanese, "This is for your safety," but the word safety had no meaning left. Safety had been cliffs, grenades, and orders to die. Now it meant being inspected by the enemy's hands. One woman broke down, her voice barely audible. "Even our own men never asked." That single line summed up the fracture between indoctrination and reality. When the check ended, the women were told to rest, but rest didn't come. They lay awake under the tarpaulin roofs, staring at their palms, counting breaths. The question, "Who among you is pregnant?" It kept repeating in their minds, peeling back layers of memory they wanted to bury. Because each heartbeat carried not just life, but a secret. Tomorrow, the interrogators would dig deeper, not into politics, but into the ghosts those pregnancies had left behind. That night, the question refused to fade. The women lay on thin canvas mats, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound, the creak of a cot, the rustle of palm leaves, triggered memories of what came before capture. They weren't just prisoners now. They were carriers of secrets their own army had buried. The pregnancies were not mysteries, they were evidence. Months earlier, before surrender, these same women had lived inside occupied island garrisons under Japanese command. They'd been told they were the backbone of morale, helpers of the sacred mission. But isolation and starvation had turned those postings into quiet nightmares. Officers took what they wanted under the banner of discipline. Some women were coerced, others ordered to comfort soldiers before final attacks. Official documents from the post for years hinted at this in careful language. Field service units and assigned companions. Historians now estimate that even civilian clerks were absorbed into these unspoken comfort systems. One woman remembered a captain who quoted poetry before violence. Another recalled being told she'd dishonor the empire if she refused. For them, pregnancy was not a crime, but proof of obedience twisted by fear. They had been trained to believe the emperor's will sanctified all acts. But now, standing under an American flag, that faith was rotting in real time. "I was never supposed to exist," one nurse later wrote in a journal, her words translated decades after. "If I lived, it meant the story was wrong." That confession captures the impossible paradox they carried. Each heartbeat inside them was both proof of survival and reminder of what survival cost. By dawn, the camp stirred again. The same American medics who had tested them now prepared charts and syringes. An interpreter called names, voice neutral, as if this were an office rather than a battlefield of memory. None of the women spoke, but their silence told its own story, a chorus of ghosts still echoing through their bodies. The Americans didn't yet understand what they'd uncovered. They thought they were managing a health issue. They didn't realize they had unearthed a moral wound, one that would take generations for Japan to even name. As the sun rose over the camp's wire fence, a new officer arrived. A young interpreter who would change everything by simply speaking differently. The new interpreter's name was Sergeant Robert Miller. He was 23, a college student from Ohio before the draft pulled him into the Pacific. His Japanese wasn't perfect, but his tone carried something the others lacked patience.
On the morning of the next inspection, Miller stepped into the tent with a clipboard and a translator's dictionary tucked under his arm.
The women tensed as usual, expecting another round of cold questions. But this time, his voice was softer.
"We just need to make sure everyone is healthy," he said through the nice, assistant beside him. "This isn't judgment, it's care." The words landed like a small explosion.
One of the older nurses, hollow-eyed from fever, whispered, "Care," as if testing its meaning for the first time.
The room fell quiet except for the hum of flies and the steady click of Miller's pen. He didn't order them to stand straighter, didn't shout for answers.
He simply listened. For the first time since capture, the women saw an American not as an interrogator but as a human being.
Miller asked each woman about her symptoms, marking notes carefully, sometimes sketching diagrams of nutrition schedules. Reports from medical archives later confirmed that his unit requested 42 midwives and nurses to be flown in after capture, part of a quiet humanitarian mission to stabilize Pacific Island.
Detainees, one nurse, her voice barely steady, admitted she was 3 months pregnant. Miller paused, then simply nodded.
"Okay, we'll make sure you have milk and vitamins." The interpreter repeated the words. No one moved. Then another woman spoke up. Soon, 17 pregnancies became names on his list. No longer secrets, just cases.
They treated pregnancy as life, not scandal. One survivor later recalled, "That simple difference shattered something inside them." For years, they had been told that worth was measured by loyalty, purity, and death. But now, in enemy hands, the opposite was true. Worth was measured by survival.
After the lineup, Miller lingered outside the tent, staring at the sea. He didn't know Japanese propaganda had painted him as a monster. He just knew these women looked more ghost than enemy. Behind him, their whispers had changed less fear, more confusion.
And confusion, in that camp, was the first sign of awakening. The next day, for the first time, the women were handed paper and pencils to write letters home. Paper felt foreign in their hands, soft, white American paper that smelled faintly of disinfectant.
The guards handed each woman a stub of pencil and a single sheet. "You may write to family in Japan," the interpreter explained.
"Letters will be checked, then sent." Checked, that word echoed through the tent like a warning. Still, for many, this was the first chance to speak to home since the war had devoured their lives.
The women wrote slowly, some shaping kanji with shaking fingers, others pressing their palms flat before every line as if to pray. One clerk named Yumi, 21, pregnant, once stationed at a communications post, wrote to a fiancé who died months earlier on Guam. She didn't know the censors would cut every mention of death, emotion, or child. "I am alive," she wrote instead. "I eat strange food and hear strange words. The ocean looks the same." Her letter would never leave the island. American censors kept the tone neutral. Emotional sentences were sliced away, leaving hollow shells of communication. Out of more than 200 letters written that week, fewer than 50 were cleared for mailing. The rest sat in a locked metal box behind the medical tent, marked "held translation pending." The women began to sense it wasn't just their bodies that were prisoners. Their words were too. "We were alive, but our voices weren't," one survivor said decades later in an interview. Each unsent letter became a small act of rebellion, proof of memory. Some women hid scraps of paper under their mats, rewriting the parts the censors cut. About hunger, about lost family, about the unborn children who kicked quietly as they wrote. One American nurse, assigned to monitor the correspondence, stumbled across Yumi's rejected letter. She read the words twice, lips pressed tight.
Something inside her broke. The next morning, she folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket instead of the burn pile. It was a small act, an invisible rebellion inside the machinery of occupation, but it would spark something larger, because that same nurse, by the end of the week, would risk her post to do something forbidden, something human. Her name was Lieutenant Margaret Hayes, a field nurse from Kansas who had patched up Marines and civilians alike since 1943. She'd seen too much blood to believe in enemies anymore. The day she read Yumi's censored letter, something in her hardened shell cracked. "They think they're protecting morale," she muttered to herself, staring at the translation sheet. "But they're burying people twice." That night, when the guards rotated, Hayes slipped into the women's tent carrying a small bundle wrapped in a towel. Inside were things no regulation authorized: vitamin tablets, baby cloth cut from surplus gauze, and a hand-copied translation of an American lullaby. "Sleep, little one, the war is done." She placed it by Yumi's cot and whispered, "You keep writing, I'll keep reading." The young clerk just stared, unsure if it was a trap. Over the next week, Hayes quietly passed along smuggled items: soap, iodine, condensed milk tins, under the guise of inventory errors. Red Cross records would later confirm 12 births in U.S. run Pacific POW camps between 1944 and 1946, all delivered under improvised care. The camp command officially denied it, but Hayes's handwritten notes survived. Mother and child stable, enemy or not, both breathing. The other women began to notice. Word spread in whispers that the American nurse was different. One night, a feverish woman murmured, "The enemy's woman sang to my child," a line that would later appear in Post war testimonies. For them, Hayes wasn't a savior. She was proof that compassion could exist even in uniform. When an officer questioned the missing supplies, she stared him down. "Maybe count fewer bullets next time," she said quietly. He didn't report her. War fatigue made even soldiers human. Inside the camp, something shifted. The women began meeting her eyes. They stopped flinching when the Americans entered. Small, invisible acts of grace were rewiring decades of fear. The Empire had taught them obedience. The enemy was teaching them dignity. Hayes didn't know her rebellion was spreading. Other medics started bending rules too. More blankets, cleaner water, extra milk, rations. What began as a single smuggled lullaby was turning into a quiet revolution. And with comfort came reflection: how could the enemy show more mercy than their own army ever had? By late 1945, the camp no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a contradiction. Every day began with routine roll call, but afterward came things that didn't fit the idea of captivity: meals, hygiene, kindness. The Japanese women were used to scarcity so severe that a grain of rice had been rationed like gold. Now, American cooks ladled thick stew into metal trays, dropped canned fruit beside it, and told them to eat more. To women who had starved under their own flag, the abundance was unsettling. "They feed us like children," whispered one former nurse, staring at her reflection in the soup's oily surface. "Even our army never gave us this much." The irony was unbearable. Every spoonful felt like defeat and survival blended together. The camp was designed by engineers who believed sanitation was victory. Wooden walkways replaced mud. Latrines were built at measured intervals. Buckets of chlorinated water were refilled twice a day. The Americans didn't talk about honor. They talked about germs, calories, and rest. In the empire they had served, hygiene had been a privilege. Here it was standard. Numbers later told the story. Records show that American-run POW camps in the Pacific had mortality rates under 2%. By contrast, prisoners held by the Japanese army died at rates exceeding 27%. The statistics were brutal not just in numbers, but in what they revealed. Industrial care could win wars faster than ideology ever could. They won because they built toilets, not slogans. One woman would later remark bitterly, "It was a quiet admission that broke centuries of pride." For the first time, they understood war wasn't just fought with rifles. It was fought with infrastructure, with logistics, with the will to keep people alive instead of glorifying their deaths. At night, under soft lantern light, the women sat in circles, their conversations shifting from fear to disbelief. "If they are devils," one said, "then why do they treat us like humans?" The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire. In that silence, identity began to collapse. And when identity collapses, something new always tries to grow in its place. By the next dusk, whispers began about guilt, about faith, about what it meant to have served an empire that worshipped death more than life. Tomorrow, one of them would finally speak that thought aloud. The confession came at dusk. The camp's generator hummed weakly, lanterns flickered, and the sea beyond the wire glowed orange with the last trace of sun. A small group of women sat together near the edge of the fence, whispering. They weren't plotting escape, they were unlearning survival. Yumi, the young clerk, broke the silence first. "I no longer believe," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried. The others stared at her, waiting. "In what?" asked one nurse. "In everything." Those two words shattered the night. For the first time, someone had said out loud what they all felt. The empire that had raised them to die had fallen. The emperor's voice on the radio weeks earlier, flat, distant, human, had ended the illusion of divinity. Yet admitting disbelief was dangerous, even in captivity. Still, no one stopped her. "We were told we were sacred." Yumi continued, "But we were only useful. When we were captured, they called us shameful. When we were alive, they called us pure. Which is it?" No one answered. The only sound was the low buzz of cicadas and the crash of waves beyond the fence. It was the sound of something collapsing, not a building, but faith itself. Post-war surveys later showed that nearly 70% of Japanese POW and internees reported losing faith in military propaganda. Numbers never capture the weight of that loss. But inside that tent, the transformation was visible in every silence, every tear that didn't fall. "We began to think like humans again," one of them recalled decades later. For the first time, they allowed guilt and grief to coexist. It wasn't betrayal, it was awakening. The Americans didn't notice. To them, the camp was a success story of discipline and care. But inside those fences, something more profound was happening. The birth of doubt, the first fragile seed of a post-war conscience. When the women were called for evening inspection, they stood straighter, not out of fear, but out of quiet defiance. They were still prisoners, but now they chose to live as witnesses. The next morning, a radio crackled in the command tent. The voice announced new orders, repatriation to Japan. The women's fates were about to shift again, this time toward home. The day the trucks came, the camp was strangely quiet. Even the gulls seemed to hover lower, as if watching the end of something fragile. It was early 1946. The war was over, but no one felt victorious. The American guards loaded the women and their few belongings, blankets, notebooks, and tiny bundles wrapped in towels, on to transport trucks bound for the docks. The island's coral roads shimmered under the heat, and every jolt reminded them that home was no longer the same place they'd left behind. The ship waiting at the pier was gray, utilitarian, with the faint smell of diesel and disinfectant. A painted emblem read U.S. Army Transport. Inside, Narrow bunks lined the walls, and the sound of metal echoed with every step. For most, this was the first time they'd been on a ship since evacuation years ago. But now they weren't soldiers or civilians. They were numbers on a repatriation list. Some women carried infants. Others carried the weight of silence. Official records later confirmed 20. 6 infants were born aboard or shortly after arrival in Yokohama. The reports didn't list fathers, only mothers. Unnamed, unranked, unspoken. The Japanese officers waiting at the port looked away when the women disembarked. Shame was the only welcome. The Empire had taught them that surrender was worse than death. Now, these survivors carried living proof that surrender had consequences. The war followed us in our arms. One woman said years later, "The babies were quiet, too young to know they'd crossed an invisible line between worlds." The American soldiers didn't speak much either. They saluted briefly, mechanical gestures fading into the fog as the ship pulled back to sea. In that moment, everything felt suspended. The women standing on Japanese soil again, unsure whether they were returning citizens or permanent outcasts. Yumi, clutching her infant, stared at the docks as news photographers snapped frames from a distance. She didn't hide her face. "Let them see," she whispered. "We lived." Those words weren't defiance. They were reclamation. A week later, newspapers printed blurred photos of Japanese women POW returning home. But one picture, of Yumi holding her child, looking directly into the lens, would outlive the headlines. Because one journalist decided to find her, and that meeting, years later, would resurrect the question that started it all. It was the spring of 1952, 7 years after surrender, when the question resurfaced. A newspaper in Tokyo ran a small feature titled "Voices of Forgotten Women." The reporter, a young man barely 30, had tracked down one of the former POW who had returned from the Pacific camps. Her name was Yumi Sato, no longer a clerk, no longer a prisoner. She was now a midwife in Yokohama, her child nearly school age. The interview took place in a narrow clinic that smelled of alcohol and boiled water. Babies cried in the next room as Yumi recounted the story. When the reporter asked what moment defined her captivity, she didn't hesitate. When they asked who among us was pregnant, she said, "That question, it divided my life in two." He expected bitterness, maybe accusation. Instead, her tone was reflective, almost gentle. "We were raised to believe death was purity," she explained, "but they, our enemies, saw life as duty. That day, I realized our empire was built on graves, not people." Her words mirrored Japan's transformation. By the early 1950s, women's literacy had soared from 57% before the war to nearly 98%. New rights, education, and work programs reshaped the country's identity. Yet Yumi's memory cut deeper than politics. That question wasn't about shame. She told him softly. It was the first time anyone had asked us to live as humans. The reporter wrote that line down exactly as she said it. When the article ran, it barely filled half a page, but letters poured in: nurses, widows, former clerks, all writing the same thing: "We remember." The question that once paralyzed them had become a symbol of awakening. Years later, historians would quote Yumi's interview in documentaries and textbooks. To them, it marked the moment the myth of divine empire gave way to something messier, truer, and infinitely more human. Standing at the clinic window, Yumi watched her son chase a ball across the yard. The wind carried children's laughter through the open shutters, the same wind that once carried orders, screams, and silence. She smiled faintly. "He will never understand what that question meant," she whispered, "and that's the point. Some wars end with treaties. Others end when a single question stops echoing.